Daniel Wright sat quietly at his desk, flipping through the pages of his worn-out notebook. It was another long day in Miss Thornton's music class, a place where he often felt more like an outsider than a student. He had always loved music, but he knew better than to draw attention to himself, especially in this class. Ms. Thornton, a stern-faced woman in her mid-50s, walked to the front of the room and tapped her ruler against the chalkboard. "All right, class. Since so many of you think you don't need to study music theory, let's put your natural talent to the test." Her eyes scanned the room before they landed on Daniel. A smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. "Daniel, why don't you come up here?" Daniel hesitated. He had a bad feeling about this. "Come on," Miss Thornton pressed. "I assume you know how to play an instrument?" A few students chuckled, sensing what was about to happen. Daniel could already hear the whispers. He sighed and stood, walking toward the front of the class. "I play a little," he said carefully. Ms. Thornton raised an eyebrow. "A little? Then let's see it." She motioned toward the grand piano in the corner of the room. "Play something. Anything." The class erupted in giggles. Daniel could feel his face growing hot. Miss Thornton's voice took on a mocking tone. "Show us what you've got, Daniel." Daniel swallowed hard. She wanted to humiliate him. But she had no idea what she had just unleashed. Daniel hesitated for a moment, staring at the polished black and white keys of the grand piano. He could feel the weight of the entire class's eyes on him, their laughter still lingering in the air. Miss Thornton crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently. "Well," she pressed. "Unless you're afraid." Daniel inhaled deeply, pushing aside his nerves. He wasn't afraid, at least, not of playing. What scared him was how people would react when they heard what he could do. Slowly, he sat down on the piano bench, his fingers hovering over the keys. At first, he pressed a few tentative notes, as if testing the waters. The room was silent, waiting for him to make a mistake, to stumble. Then, in an instant, everything changed. His fingers began to glide effortlessly across the keys, releasing a melody that was both powerful and mesmerizing. A rich, soulful tune filled the room, echoing off the walls. It wasn't a simple nursery rhyme or a basic exercise. It was music that carried emotion, depth, and passion. The snickering stopped. The class sat frozen in place, their jaws slowly dropping. Even Miss Thornton's smirk faltered as she watched Daniel's hands dance across the piano. His playing was effortless, fluid, and undeniably brilliant. The melody grew more intense, his skill undeniable. Some students exchanged stunned glances, unable to believe what they were witnessing. This wasn't just someone playing a song, this was a performance. Ms. Thornton took a step forward, her face pale. This was not the outcome she had expected, and Daniel was just getting started. As Daniel's fingers moved across the piano keys, the melody filled the classroom with an energy none of them had ever felt before. The notes weren't just music, they told a story, one of struggle, resilience, and triumph. His playing wasn't rehearsed or mechanical. It was raw, emotional, and breathtakingly beautiful. The students who had been laughing just moments before now sat completely still, their expressions shifting from amusement to awe. Even those who had whispered insults under their breath were speechless. Ms. Thornton's face had lost all its smugness. Her arms, once crossed with arrogance, slowly dropped to her sides. She had expected Daniel to fumble, to embarrass himself in front of the entire class. Instead, he was proving her wrong in a way she never anticipated. Daniel closed his eyes as his hands danced effortlessly over the keys, losing himself in the music. This wasn't just about proving something to Miss Thornton or his classmates. This was about proving something to himself. By the time he struck the final note, a deep silence settled over the room. It wasn't an awkward silence, but one filled with disbelief and admiration. For a few seconds, no one moved. No one even breathed. Then, unexpectedly, a single clap broke the silence. A "T" came from the back of the classroom. A girl with blonde hair and wide eyes hesitated, then clapped again. Within moments, another student joined in. And then another. Soon, the entire room erupted in applause. Everyone, except Miss Thornton, her face was red with frustration, her lips pressed tightly together. This wasn't how it was supposed to go, and Daniel knew it. Thornton's fingers curled into fists as the classroom filled with applause. She had expected Daniel to struggle, to embarrass himself in front of everyone. But instead, he had just delivered a performance that had left every student in awe. Her face burned with frustration as she forced a smile. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "that was unexpected." Daniel turned to face her, his expression calm but confident. "Is that all, Miss Thornton?" he asked, his voice steadied out. A few students chuckled, sensing the shift in power. Just minutes ago, Miss Thornton had held complete control over the room, but now, it was Daniel who commanded the respect of his peers. Miss Thornton started, but she couldn't find the words. How could she admit that she had underestimated him? That she had wanted to humiliate him but had ended up humiliated herself? One of the students, a boy named Jason, leaned forward in his seat. "Where'd you learn to play like that, Daniel?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Daniel shrugged. "My grandmother taught me. She used to be a piano teacher before she passed away." A hush fell over the room. Even the students who had mocked him earlier now looked at him with something close to admiration. Ms. Thornton straightened her posture, trying to regain control. "Well," she said sharply, "that was a decent performance. But don't let this get to your head, Daniel. One song doesn't make you special." The applause faded, but the looks on the students' faces said otherwise. Daniel simply smiled. He didn't need her validation. He had already won. The next day at school, the energy in the classroom had shifted. Daniel noticed the way his classmates looked at him differently, not with pity or dismissal, but with curiosity and respect. The whispers that used to mock him now carried admiration. "Did you hear him play yesterday?" Jason asked a group of students near the lockers. "Man, I thought he was gonna mess up, but he was better than anyone I've ever heard." Even students from other classes had heard about what happened. By lunchtime, Daniel was the center of attention, a stark contrast from how things had been before. But not everyone was happy. Miss Thornton sat at her desk, fuming as she overheard students still talking about Daniel's performance. She had prided herself on her authority, on maintaining control, but one student, one boy she had tried to humiliate, had shattered that. Determined to reclaim her power, she called Daniel to her desk before class started. "You think you're special now, don't you?" she said coldly, her eyes sharp. Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "I don't think I'm special," he replied calmly. "I just did what you asked." Her fingers drummed against the desk. "Let's see if you can handle real pressure, then. There's a school recital next week. If you're as talented as you claim, you should have no problem performing in front of the entire school. A challenge. A test." Daniel knew what she was trying to do, setting him up to fail on a bigger stage. But instead of backing down, he smiled. "I'd love to." For the first time, Miss Thornton felt a twinge of uncertainty. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. Word spread fast. Daniel would be performing at the school recital. The announcement turned heads, fueling excitement and curiosity. Students who had never paid him any mind before suddenly wanted to know everything about him. "Yo, Daniel, what are you gonna play?" Jason asked, walking beside him in the hallway. Daniel shrugged. "Not sure yet." Truthfully, he had an idea, but he wasn't going to reveal it just yet. He wanted it to be a surprise, not just for the audience, but especially for Miss Thornton. Meanwhile, Miss Thornton was preparing her own plan. If she couldn't embarrass Daniel through direct humiliation, she'd ensure he stumbled another way. She pulled some strings with the music department, making sure Daniel would only get the old, out-of-tune piano for his performance. If he hit the wrong notes in front of the entire school, he'd never recover from the embarrassment. "Let's see how talented he really is," she muttered under her breath, but Daniel wasn't worried about the piano. When he arrived at the practice room that afternoon, he closed his eyes and ran his fingers over the keys, adjusting to the imperfections. A great pianist could make even a broken instrument sing. As he played, a soft knock on the door made him stop. He turned to see Mrs. Dawson, the school's choir director, standing there with a warm smile. "I heard about your performance," she said. "And I heard you play the other day. You've got real talent, Daniel." "Thanks," he said, surprised. She hesitated, then asked, "Would you like some help preparing for the recital?" Daniel had always practiced alone. But for some reason, he felt like Mrs. Dawson truly wanted to see him succeed. He smiled. "I'd love that." Unbeknownst to him, this partnership would change everything. As the days counted down to the recital, Miss Thornton became more desperate. Seeing Daniel gain confidence with each passing day infuriated her. She had expected him to stumble under pressure, but instead, he seemed to thrive. Worse, the other students were beginning to admire him. "He's getting too comfortable," she muttered to herself. That's when she came up with a new plan. If the old, out-of-tune piano wasn't enough to humiliate him, she would ensure his sheet music mysteriously disappeared on the day of the recital. Without it, he'd be forced to play from memory, something that would surely cause him to fail under pressure. Meanwhile, Daniel continued practicing with Mrs. Dawson. She was not only helping him refine his technique, but also teaching him how to handle performance anxiety. "You need to own the moment, Daniel," she told him. "The piano doesn't control you, you control it. If something goes wrong, adapt. Music isn't about perfection, it's about expression." Daniel nodded, soaking in her advice. He had never performed in front of such a large audience before, but for the first time, he felt ready. What he didn't know was that Miss Thornton had one final trick up her sleeve. The night before the recital, she snuck into the music room and took Daniel's sheet music from his folder. "No way he plays without this," she whispered, stuffing it into her bag. She walked away, convinced she had just sealed his fate. But what she didn't realize was that Daniel had already memorized every note. The night of the recital had arrived. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and parents, all eager to see the performances. The grand piano stood under the bright stage lights, polished and gleaming. Backstage, Daniel took deep breaths, calming his nerves. He had worked hard for this moment, and he refused to let anything shake him. Ms. Thornton, standing nearby, smirked as she approached him. "I hope you're ready, Daniel," she said, feigning concern. "Oh, and I noticed your sheet music is missing." "That's a shame. Playing without it will be challenging." Daniel froze for a moment, then met her eyes with quiet confidence. "I'll be fine," he said simply. Ms. Thornton narrowed her eyes. She had expected panic, but Daniel didn't seem worried. She turned away, frustrated. As the recital began, one by one, students walked onto the stage and performed their pieces. Some stumbled nervously, while others played well enough, earning polite applause. As each performance ended, Daniel felt his anticipation grow. Finally, the host announced, "Next, we have Daniel Carter performing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata." Daniel took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. As he sat at the piano, a hush fell over the audience. His fingers hovered over the keys, ready to begin. Ms. Thornton folded her arms, waiting for his inevitable failure. She could already imagine the embarrassment on his face when he froze without his sheet music. But then, as Daniel pressed the first key, something incredible happened. He played with absolute confidence. Each note was flawless, filled with emotion and skill. The audience sat in stunned silence, captivated by the music. Ms. Thornton's smirk faded. This wasn't just playing, this was something extraordinary. And she had just made a terrible mistake. The moment Daniel's fingers touched the keys, the room fell silent. The soft, haunting melody of Moonlight Sonata filled the auditorium, each note resonating with precision and depth. His hands moved effortlessly across the piano, playing as if the music lived within him. Ms. Thornton's smug expression quickly turned to disbelief. She had expected a disaster, stumbling notes, hesitation, maybe even humiliation. But instead, Daniel played like a true pianist, like someone who had mastered the instrument far beyond his years. The audience was spellbound. Parents leaned forward in their seats, teachers exchanged surprised glances, and even the other students, who had once laughed at Daniel, were captivated by his performance. As Daniel reached the most emotional part of the piece, he closed his eyes, feeling the music flow through him. He wasn't just playing to prove something, he was playing because this was his passion. In the front row, his mother wiped away a tear, overwhelmed with pride. She had always known his talent, but to see him shine in front of everyone, despite the obstacles, was more than she could have hoped for. Even Principal Hastings, who had overheard Miss Thornton's dismissive remarks earlier, watched in amazement. This was no ordinary student, this was a prodigy. As the final note echoed through the auditorium, a moment of silence followed. Then, the audience erupted into thunderous applause. Parents stood up, giving Daniel a standing ovation. Some even whistled in appreciation. Daniel turned to look at Miss Thornton. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly open in shock. She had tried to set him up for failure, but instead, he had given a performance that would be remembered for years, and as Daniel stood to take a bow, he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. As the applause filled the auditorium, Daniel took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. This was his victory, not just over Miss Thornton's prejudice, but over every doubt, every whisper, every attempt to belittle him. Ms. Thornton, still frozen in place, finally blinked as Principal Hastings approached her. "Miss Thornton," he said, his voice calm but firm, "a word, please." She swallowed hard and nodded, following him backstage. Daniel watched as they disappeared behind the curtain, his heart still pounding. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew he had made his point. A moment later, Principal Hastings returned to the stage, standing beside Daniel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "talent is not determined by the color of one's skin. Daniel has proven that today. And let me make one thing clear, our school stands for inclusion and respect. We will not tolerate discrimination of any kind." A second wave of applause filled the room, and Daniel felt his mother's arms wrap around him from behind. "I am so proud of you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. Ms. Thornton reappeared, looking humbler than before. Her usual stern expression was replaced with something different, shame, perhaps, or even regret. She walked toward Daniel hesitantly. She began, then took a deep breath. "I misjudged you. And I owe you an apology." Daniel looked at her, measuring her words. He wasn't sure if she had truly learned her lesson, but at least she was admitting her mistake. "Thank you," he said simply. Principal Hastings turned back to the audience. "And with that, let's give one more round of applause for Daniel Carter, our rising star." The cheers grew even louder, and as Daniel stood there, soaking it all in, he realized something. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for every kid who had ever been underestimated, for every person who had been judged unfairly. Ms. Thornton had tried to humiliate him. Instead, he had taught her a lesson she would never forget. If you were inspired by Daniel's journey, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Have you ever faced a situation where someone underestimated you? How did you handle it? Let's start a conversation. And if you love stories like this, make sure to follow for more powerful and eye-opening narratives.